Story 1. Dusty Whispers. The New Mexico sun, a brutal, unwavering eye in the vast blue, hammered down on Dust Devil Springs, baking the already cracked asphalt and bleaching the few remaining colors from the dilapidated buildings. Dr. Elias Thorne, his throat already dry from the desert air, parked his beat-up pickup truck at the dusty edge of what barely qualified as a main street. Stepping out, the heat hit him like a physical weight. But it was the silence that truly settled in his bones. A thick, absolute silence, broken only by the occasional mournful creak of a loose sign swinging in the non-existent breeze. Dust Devil Springs. The name itself had a kind of forgotten poetry to it, a whisper of the wild winds that now only carried the scent of dry earth and decay. Elias unfolded a brittle, yellowed map, tracing the faded lines of streets that now lay choked with weeds and tumbleweeds. According to the archives, this had been a boom town in the early 1900s, a place where miners had clawed fortunes from the earth. Now it was just a skeleton, picked clean by time and some unknown event that had emptied it entirely. He shouldered his pack, the weight of his research equipment a familiar comfort in this unsettling stillness. His boots crunched on the gravel and broken glass that littered the sidewalk in front of what was once likely a bustling general store. The windows were jagged teeth in a gaping maw, offering glimpses into a darkness thick with dust and shadows. He peered inside, seeing overturned shelves and scattered merchandise, frozen mid-fall, like Pompeii frozen in ash. Walking further into town, Elias noted the small details that spoke volumes of the suddenness of the abandonment. A child's tricycle lay on its side in the middle of the road, its paint faded and tires flat. A half-finished game of checkers sat on a porch swing, the pieces petrified in their last strategic moves. It wasn't just decay. It was a snapshot of lives abruptly interrupted. The town square, if you could call it that, was dominated by a rusted-out water pump and a crumbling monument whose inscription had long since been eroded by the harsh desert winds. A single forlorn swing set in the small, overgrown park creaked rhythmically, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Elias watched it for a long moment, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He made his way towards the old schoolhouse, a two-story brick building with boarded-up windows that stared out like vacant eyes. As he approached, he noticed a faded hopscotch grid chalked onto the cracked pavement, the lines barely visible beneath layers of dust. Near it, a child's drawing, rendered in surprisingly fresh-looking chalk, depicted a stick-figure family standing in front of a crooked house under a bright yellow sun. The contrast between the vibrant drawing and the desolate reality sent a shiver down Elias's spine. Who had been here recently? The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that only seemed to deepen the shadows engulfing the town. Elias decided to seek shelter in the old church for the night. The heavy wooden doors groaned in protest as he pushed them open, releasing a wave of stagnant air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. Inside, the sanctuary was bathed in the eerie glow of the setting sun filtering through stained glass windows, their vibrant colors muted by layers of dust. The altar held a dusty Bible, its pages swollen and warped, and beside it, a bridal bouquet so withered it was impossible to tell what kind of flowers it had once been. In the back pews, Elias spotted a leather-bound journal lying open on a seat. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded, but he carefully began to read. The journal belonged to the town's last pastor, chronicling the slow unraveling of Dust Devil Springs. At first there were strange noises in the night, livestock going missing, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. Then people started disappearing one or two at a time, with no explanation. The entries grew increasingly frantic, filled with mentions of whispers on the wind and shadows moving in the periphery. The last entry was just a scrawled, almost illegible sentence. "They are under the dust." As Elias finished reading, a distinct scraping sound echoed from the far end of the church. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the stone floor of the sacristy. He held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. Slowly, cautiously, he rose from the pew and peered into the gloom towards the back. He could make out a dark shape shifting in the shadows. He slipped silently out of the church and moved around the side, his senses on high alert. He found himself in the overgrown graveyard, the leaning headstones casting long, distorted shadows in the twilight. He noticed that while most of the graves were old and weathered, a small section in the back held newer markers, some with dates from just a few years prior. One grave in particular had a small hand-carved wooden cross and a scattering of dried wildflowers that looked relatively recent. Someone was still tending to this grave. Just then he felt a cold spot right behind him, and a breath, thin and icy, brushed the back of his neck. A dry, raspy whisper slithered into his ear. "Leave us be!" Elias whirled around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the silent rows of tombstones. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, the old journal getting to him. But then the whisper came again, closer, more insistent, tinged with an unbearable sorrow. "You're walking on them." Panic seized Elias. He bolted, running blindly through the graveyard, stumbling over unseen stones. He burst out onto the deserted street and ran towards the edge of town, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he fled, he could have sworn he saw movement in the dark windows of the abandoned houses, fleeting shadows that seemed to watch him pass. He heard footsteps behind him, a rhythmic cadence that wasn't his own. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, his lungs burning. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As he finally started the engine, he glanced back at Dust Devil Springs. Under the pale moonlight, it looked like a ghost town carved from bone. And then, from the darkened steeple of the church, a single, mournful toll of a bell echoed through the stillness. It was followed by absolute silence. Elias slammed the truck into gear and sped away. The image of the silent, watching town burned into his mind. In his rearview mirror, as he left the dusty confines of Dust Devil Springs, he could just make out a new, crudely painted addition to the welcome sign. "And you'll never leave." Story 2, The Secret of the Rusty Circle. Sarah, her trusty metal detector humming a hopeful tune, navigated the winding, unpaved roads of rural West Virginia, the GPS on her phone stubbornly refusing to cooperate. The directions to the abandoned Red Creek farm had come from a cryptic entry in an antique journal she'd picked up at a flea market, hinting at a buried treasure and strange rituals performed on the land. Finally, through a break in the dense woods, she saw the skeletal remains of the farmhouse, its roof sagging like a broken spine, the windows gaping black holes staring out at the overgrown fields. The air was thick with humidity and the cloying sweetness of decay. The farmhouse stood like a lonely sentinel, surrounded by collapsing barns and outbuildings, each whispering tales of neglect and forgotten lives. Sarah felt a prickle of unease, a sense of trespassing on hallowed ground. She activated her metal detector, its rhythmic beeps a stark contrast to the oppressive silence. She started her search around the perimeter of the farmhouse, the detector occasionally chirping excitedly at buried bits of farm equipment, rusty tools, and the ubiquitous nails, But it was in the large, untamed field behind the house, where the grass grew waist-high and wildflowers bloomed in chaotic profusion, that the detector went wild, emitting a high-pitched, insistent whine. Sarah's heart pounded with anticipation. Whatever was buried here was big and metallic. She grabbed the shovel from her car and began to dig, the damp earth yielding easily. Hours passed under the sweltering sun, punctuated by the buzzing of insects and Sarah's determined grunts. Finally, the edge of something hard and circular emerged from the soil, encrusted with rust and dirt. Carefully, she cleared away the remaining earth, revealing a large metal ring, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. Its surface was covered in intricate, unfamiliar symbols, a swirling vortex surrounded by geometric patterns and what looked like stylized figures. Sarah had never seen anything like them. They seemed ancient, alien, yet somehow disturbingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream. As she tried to brush away the loose soil from the symbols, her fingers traced the cold, rough metal. A sudden wave of nausea washed over her, and she felt a dizzying disorientation. Then, from the far side of the field, carried on the still air, she heard a faint, sorrowful moan. She straightened up, scanning the tall grass, but saw nothing. It must have been the wind whistling through the dilapidated structures. But then the moan came again, closer this time, more distinct. Almost like it was emanating from the earth itself right beneath the metal circle. A deep primal fear began to grip Sarah. The coldness radiating from the rusty ring seemed to intensify, chilling her to the bone despite the heat. The symbols now seemed to pulse with a faint, inner darkness. Compelled by an irresistible, morbid curiosity, Sarah cautiously stepped into the center of the circle. As her boots settled on the cold metal, the world around her seemed to warp and distort. The air grew heavy. The sunlight dimmed as if an unseen cloud had passed overhead, but the sky took on a strange, sickly shade of red. The tall grass around the circle rustled as if agitated by an unseen force. Then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble subtly. Around the perimeter of the rusty ring, the soil started to crack and heave. Slowly, agonizingly, pale, gaunt faces began to emerge from the earth. Their eyes wide and vacant, their mouths agape in silent screams. A chorus of faint, mournful moans filled the air, growing in intensity with each emerging figure. Sarah tried to scramble out of the circle, but her feet felt rooted to the spot as if held by invisible tendrils. The figures continued to rise, their decaying bodies pulling themselves from the soil, reaching towards her with skeletal hands. The air grew heavy with the stench of damp earth, and something else, something ancient and foul. The moans intensified, becoming a cacophony of despair that echoed in Sarah's mind. As the figures drew closer, their vacant eyes seemed to focus on her, filled with an unbearable sadness and a silent plea. Sarah could make out tattered remnants of old-fashioned clothing on their emaciated frames, hinting at a long-forgotten era. She felt a wave of overwhelming sorrow and terror wash over her. Just as the first of the figures reached the edge of the circle, its cold, clammy hand brushing against her leg, the red sky began to pulse with an eerie light. The moans reached a fever pitch, and the ground vibrated violently. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. When she finally dared to open them again, the red light had faded, the tremors had stopped, and the figures were gone, receding back into the earth as quickly as they had appeared. The only sign of their presence was the disturbed soil around the rusty circle. Sarah stood trembling in the center, the cold metal beneath her feet, a stark reminder of what she had just witnessed. She backed slowly out of the circle, her mind reeling. She had to get away from this place. Grabbing her shovel and detector, she ran back to her car, not daring to look back. As she sped away down the dirt road, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the Red Creek farm silhouetted against the fading light. In the middle of the field, the rusty circle gleamed ominously in the twilight, waiting. The next morning, the Red Creek farm stood silent and still. In the field, the rusty circle remained undisturbed. A patch of freshly turned earth surrounded it, the only evidence of the night's terror. Sarah's car was gone, and with it, the fleeting memory of the faces that had risen from the ground. But deep in her mind, the silent screams echoed on. Story 3. Radio Silence. Ben, a man whose calloused hands and keen ear were more attuned to the crackle of vacuum tubes than the drone of modern life, sought refuge in the forgotten corners of the American South. Harmony Creek, Alabama, wasn't even a speck on most maps, just a cluster of decaying buildings swallowed by the encroaching pines. His small, ramshackle cabin, a relic itself, sat just beyond the town's ghostly outskirts, a haven of dusty wires and the comforting scent of aging electronics. Days bled into weeks, filled with the meticulous work of restoring antique radios, bringing their silent circuits back to life. But the stillness of Harmony Creek was far from peaceful. It was a pregnant silence, heavy with an unspoken history. As night fell, the darkness seemed to seep into the very wood of his cabin, and with it came the whispers, faint, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, not carried on the wind. One night the heavens opened, unleashing a furious thunderstorm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ancient trees in stark, flickering flashes, and the thunder rattled the very foundations of Ben's cabin. Amidst the chaos, an old shortwave radio he'd been coaxing back to life on his workbench suddenly sputtered and crackled. A garbled, static-laced voice, like a phantom trying to break through the veil, filled the small room. Ben, initially thinking he'd finally caught a distant signal, leaned closer, his hopes rising. But the voice remained distorted, a jumble of static punctuated by fleeting whispers that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of comprehension. He fiddled with the antenna, twisting the dials, trying every frequency, but the sounds only intensified in their eerie unintelligibility. There was a chilling undercurrent to the static, a sense of something sentient trying to communicate. As the hours crawled by and the storm eventually subsided, leaving a damp, heavy silence in its wake. But the radio continued its strange broadcast. The whispers became more frequent, sometimes sounding like hushed conversations, other times like desperate pleas. Ben, his initial curiosity now tinged with a growing unease, began recording the transmissions on an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. The next morning, under the weak sunlight filtering through the dusty windows, Ben listened to the recordings. He strained his ears, trying to isolate the faint voices from the persistent static. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to discern words, phrases that sent a cold dread creeping through him. "Can you hear us? We're still here. Don't let them find you." And the most chilling of all, repeated like a broken record, "Come home." Driven by a gnawing need to understand, Ben ventured into Harmony Creek. The dirt road leading into town was overgrown, barely visible beneath a carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves. The abandoned houses stood like hollow-eyed specters, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. As he walked the deserted streets, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes peering from the darkness within the broken windows. He reached the town square where a rusted water pump stood sentinel over a patch of weeds. The old general store looked as if its patrons had simply vanished mid-purchase. On the decaying wall of the post office, a faded, tattered missing person poster caught his eye. The photograph was of a young woman with kind eyes and a hopeful smile. The date she went missing corresponded with the time the radio whispers had started on his recordings. There were other posters too, older and more faded, each depicting a face lost to Harmony Creek. Back in his cabin, as dusk began to settle, the radio on his workbench crackled with renewed intensity. The whispers were clearer now, laced with a palpable urgency and a chilling sense of despair. You shouldn't have come back. They don't want you here. You'll end up like the rest of us. Ben reached for the power switch, but his hand passed right through it. The switch was no longer connected. The knob spun freely. The radio was operating on its own. The sounds emanating from the speaker grew louder, morphing from whispers into anguished moans and choked sobs. The single light bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling flickered violently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, howling like a banshee through the trees. Ben huddled in the corner, his hands clamped over his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his very skull. Suddenly, all the lights in the cabin went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. The only sound was the relentless static and the heart-wrenching cries from the radio. Then, amidst the chaos, he heard a new sound. A sharp, piercing scream that cut through the air, followed by an abrupt, chilling silence from the radio. The darkness in the cabin felt heavier now, as if something else had entered the room. The next morning, the sun rose on an empty cabin. The front door was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. On the workbench, the old radio sat silent, its tubes dark and cold. Ben was gone. On the dusty floor beside the radio, a new hastily printed missing person poster lay face up. The photograph was of Ben, his eyes wide with a terror that still seemed to linger in the grainy image. The date he went missing was the previous night. The wind whispered through the empty cabin, carrying no sound of the voices that had filled the darkness. Story 4. Reflection in the Glass. Emily, a freelance photographer with a penchant for the forgotten and the forlorn, had heard whispers of Blackwood Manor for years, tales of a grand estate swallowed by the wilderness, a place where shadows held secrets, and the air itself seemed heavy with unspoken sorrow. Finally, armed with her trusty vintage camera and a healthy dose of morbid curiosity, she found herself at the end of a long, winding driveway, the imposing silhouette of the manor looming through the overgrown trees like a forgotten monarch on its crumbling throne. The wrought iron gates at the entrance were rusted shut, their intricate designs twisted and broken. Emily had to hike through the dense, untamed grounds, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The manor itself was a Gothic monstrosity of dark stone and decaying wood, its numerous windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world that had long since moved on. Stepping through a creaking, half-rotted door, Emily found herself in a cavernous entrance hall. Dust lay thick on everything, muffling her footsteps. Cobwebs draped like macabre decorations from the high ceilings, and the grand staircase that spiraled upwards seemed to disappear into the gloom. A palpable chill permeated the air, a coldness that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. Emily spent the next few hours exploring the manor, her camera clicking steadily. Each room was a tableau of forgotten grandeur, tattered velvet curtains, overturned furniture draped in dusty sheets, portraits on the walls with eyes that seemed to follow her. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling and the soft whir of her camera. Yet with every step deeper into the manor, Emily felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that she wasn't entirely alone. On the second floor, she found a long, narrow hallway stretching into shadow. The air here felt colder, heavier. Along the walls hung more portraits, their subjects stern-faced figures from a bygone era. At the very end of the hallway, bathed in a sliver of weak sunlight filtering through a grimy window, stood a large, ornate, antique mirror. Its gilded frame was chipped and tarnished, but the glass itself was remarkably clear. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, Emily approached the mirror. Its surface reflected the hallway back to her, distorted by the aged glass. She saw her own pale face, framed by shadows, and the seemingly endless corridor stretching behind her. As she raised her camera to capture the eerie scene, she noticed something in the reflection that made her blood run cold. Behind her, in the shadowed depths of the hallway, as reflected in the mirror, stood a tall, indistinct figure. Emily whirled around, her heart pounding, but the hallway behind her was empty, just the faded wallpaper and the silent portraits. She told herself it was a trick of the light, a shadow playing games in the dimness. But when she glanced back at the mirror, the figure was still there, clearer this time. It was tall and gaunt, shrouded in shadow, its face a blur of darkness. And then, impossibly, it moved, its shadowy hand reaching out towards her reflection in the glass. Terror seized Emily. She stumbled back from the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. She turned and fled down the hallway. The image of the figure in the mirror burned into her mind. In every dusty mirror or reflective surface, she passed a tarnished silver tray. A cracked window pane, she caught glimpses of the figure. Always behind her in the reflection, always a step closer. As she descended the grand staircase, the figure's reflection was now clearly visible in the large hall mirror at the bottom. It was no longer a shadowy outline. It had a gaunt, elongated face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. A cold, cruel smile twisted its lips. And then the reflection spoke. Its voice, a dry, rasping whisper that seemed to come from the mirror itself, yet echoed in Emily's mind. "You can't escape us." Emily's scream was trapped in her chest. She felt a cold dread wash over her, a sense of utter helplessness. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, its long, skeletal fingers reaching towards the glass. Emily instinctively raised her own hand, her fingers trembling as they met the cold, unyielding surface of the mirror. A jolt of icy energy shot through her body. In the reflection, the figure's smile widened, and its eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. Emily felt a strange sensation, as if something was trying to pull her through the glass, to merge her with the darkness on the other side. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder, a chorus of voices echoing from within the mirror. "Welcome home, Emily. You're one of us now." Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, the sound like a mournful wail. The shadows in the manor deepened, and the air grew colder. Emily stood frozen, trapped between the real world and the terrifying reflection staring back at her. Days later, Blackwood Manor remained silent, its secrets locked within its decaying walls. The front door hung open, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, in the dusty hall, the grand mirror reflected only the empty space where Emily had stood. But if one looked closely, deep within the glass, a faint, almost imperceptible smile could be seen, lingering in the shadows. Story 5, Valley of Silent Screams. The sign, a rusted metal placard riddled with bullet holes, leaned precariously against a weathered wooden post. "Silent Hollow, keep out." Beneath it, scrawled in faded paint, someone had added, "They still hear you." Mark, a writer drawn to the macabre like a moth to a flickering flame, ignored the warnings, his battered pickup truck bouncing along the rutted, overgrown track leading into the valley. Silent Hollow. The name itself whispered of forgotten tragedies. Local lore spoke of a thriving mining community that had vanished overnight decades ago, leaving behind only empty homes and a lingering sense of dread. Some whispered of a mine collapse, others of a mysterious illness, but the most persistent legends told of restless spirits forever trapped in the valley, their silent screams echoing through the desolate landscape. The air grew noticeably colder as Mark descended into the valley, the towering pines on either side blocking out the weak afternoon sun. A thick, clinging fog snaked through the trees, shrouding the abandoned cabins in an eerie, ethereal mist. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots on the gravel path and the distant, mournful call of a crow. The silence in Silent Hollow wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in on him, amplifying the frantic beating of his own heart. The valley floor was a chaotic jumble of decaying structures, collapsed roofs, broken windows, and overgrown gardens reclaiming what was once theirs. Mark wandered through the skeletal remains of the town, his notebook in hand, jotting down observations. A child's swing set rusted in the yard of a dilapidated house, its chains twisted and motionless. Inside another, a table was set for a meal that had never been finished, the plates covered in a thick layer of dust. He eventually found his way to the old mine entrance, a gaping maw of darkness carved into the side of the hill. A chilling draft emanated from within, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint metallic tang that made Mark's nostrils flare. Despite a growing sense of unease, his curiosity compelled him forward. He pulled out his flashlight and ventured into the darkness. The mine shaft was claustrophobic and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Water dripped from the low ceiling, echoing in the oppressive silence. The beam of his flashlight danced across the rough-hewn walls, revealing rotting timbers and rusting mining equipment. Deeper he went, the darkness swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. Then he heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the mine. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and shone his flashlight around, but saw only the cold, unyielding rock. He dismissed it as his imagination playing tricks. But then the whisper came again, clearer this time, closer, as if someone was right beside him, their voice a breathy rasp filled with pain. "Lost. Can't get out. Leave this place." Panic surged through Mark. He stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground, plunging him into absolute darkness. He scrambled out of the mine, his heart pounding against his ribs, and didn't stop running until he was back in the relative light of the valley. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the abandoned cabins like restless spirits. The whispers followed him, carried on the mist, growing in intensity, multiplying into a chorus of faint, sorrowful voices. He felt like he was surrounded by unseen presences, their grief a palpable weight in the air. He stumbled past a small, dilapidated church, its windows boarded up. Suddenly, one of the boards creaked open, and Mark caught a glimpse of a pale face staring out at him from the darkness within. The eyes were wide and filled with an unspeakable sadness, a silent plea for help. He froze, his hand reaching out, but fear held him rooted to the spot. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, the board creaking shut once more. As he desperately tried to find his way back up the path leading out of the valley, the fog disoriented him. He tripped over a gnarled tree root and fell hard, his head hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Dazed and disoriented, he looked up to see shadowy figures emerging from the swirling mist, surrounding him. They were pale and translucent, their faces contorted in silent agony. Tears of a thick, black substance streamed down their spectral cheeks. Mark tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't work. The figures reached for him with cold, ethereal hands, their touch sending a wave of icy dread through his body. Their silent cries filled his mind, a symphony of suffering that echoed the valley's name. The last thing he saw was the overwhelming despair in their hollow eyes as the fog closed in and the silent screams enveloped him. The next morning, the sun finally burned through the fog, revealing Silent Hollow in all its desolate emptiness. The rusted sign still stood at the entrance, a stark warning unheeded. On the path, near where the mine entrance lay hidden by the mist, Mark's notebook lay open. The last entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, read, "They're not silent. They're trapped, and they don't want to be alone." Mark was gone, another soul claimed by the valley of silent screams, his own final cry unheard in the oppressive stillness.